Rachel's, like the two Ronnies, or Rachel Squared, which is a better name. It's very confusing that we're both in the same team, so you'll have to bear with us today. But thank you so much for taking the time to attend this webinar this afternoon. It's really good to join you. As Claire mentioned, my name is Rachel Quine. I'm the Restorative Approaches Service Manager for Royal Borough of Greenwich, which sits within the Education, Psychology and Wellbeing Service. For me, my background is in restorative practice. I've been a practitioner in various fields in restorative practice for about 18 years now. So it's yeah, it's really great to be with you. Rachel, I don't know if you want to give a quick intro and then you can go on to the aims.
Yeah, hi. So I'm Rachel O'Connor and I'm the acting principal educational psychologist and strategic lead in the emotional psychology and wellbeing service. My background's in teaching and publishing. And I've noticed there's quite a few people from Kent actually coming up on the chat, and I've worked as an educational psychologist in both Kent and Greenwich.
Brilliant. So in terms of what we're going to do today, if we could just go to the next slide, we're going to do that awkward next slide, please, thing throughout the presentation. So sorry about that, people. But in terms of what we hope to do, so it's going to be probably 2/3 of Rachel O'Connor. Don't know how that works with our Rachel Squared mathematical relationship, but we're going to be talking about an overview of emotionally based school avoidance, or EBSA, and what that means, and kind of some of the factors of it. And within that discussion, other Rachel is going to be explaining a little bit about the kind of hoping to understand about the relationship between bullying and difficult peer relationships in school, or difficult relationships generally, and EBSA. And then the last third of the session will be kind of talking about restorative practice as a sort of potentially useful tool when we're supporting positive relationships, and also how it can minimize the push factors involved in EBSA. And we'll kind of explain a little bit more about what that means. And just a quick thing to say before I hand over to Rachel, that obviously restorative practice, we have training courses that last an entire year based on that is. So it's going to be a very quick kind of overview of the key aspects of it, and then talking about one of our projects that is more about how we apply it. So for those of you some of you I know on this chat have a very high level of knowledge, some of you maybe less kind of know about restorative practice. So it's just going to be a brief overview so we can really link it to our topic today. So yeah, thank you very much. And Rachel, I'll hand over to you.
Hi, yeah, so thank you so much for joining us, and it's lovely to be here. So Rachel and I don't know how unusual it is, but so to have the educational psychology team and the restorative approaches team to be working so closely together, but it does give that opportunity to start to think about how you can use restorative approaches and I guess psychological approaches more closely. I'm aware there's a few academics here, so I thought I should make sure I'm being clear about my definitions. And there are a number of different words and phrases that tend to be kind of bandied around in terms of attendance. So most teachers, we kind of start with sort of authorised and unauthorised absence. And then within unauthorised absences, there's a number of different definitions, one being truancy, which would normally be where the child or young person is absent on the whole without their parents' awareness, and there'll be occasion, well, it tends to be linked with antisocial behaviour, potentially out of school, school withdrawal, which might be where the parents are not feeling safe letting the child to go to school, or for another reason the child's being kept at home. And one phrase that really since about sort of 2018 we've started to use more and more, which is emotional based school avoidance. And the definition we've got here is a broad umbrella term used to describe a group of children, young people who have severe difficulty in attending school due to emotional factors, often resulting in prolonged absences from school. So I mean, the definitions are as useful or as, are always limited in their use. It's not sort of saying that one area requires more support than others. It's just looking at the different types of support that's available and trying to understand without judgment really what the factors affecting behaviour are. So we're going to be focusing on emotional based school avoidance, Historically, the term school refuser was used, but we tend to have moved away from that now, because it implies, the idea of refuser implies that it gives a kind of within child outlook on the issue. So sort of implying that the child's refusing to go into school rather than acknowledging the huge range of barriers that they might be encountering to attendance. Right, EBSA. So a child who has significant difficulties attending school, emotional distress when faced with attending school, staying home with the knowledge of the parents and carers and school staff. And there doesn't tend to be associated with antisocial behaviours. It's much more associated with finding it difficult to cross the barrier into school, or sometimes to actually leave the home. And actually I'll talk about that later. It's something that's been increasing. I've got some statistics here that go up to 2022. I mean, there's actually been an increase since then, but if you look at total absence over the years from 2018 to sort of post-COVID 2022, you see a big increase in the total absence, and a larger increase in persistent absence, which is when a child is away for as missing 10% of their lessons. And this is the secondary one. We certainly within Greenwich, within the Educational Psychology Service, see increased EBSA at secondary school. So every child's experience of EBSA is unique to them, but usually we usually anticipate that anxiety is going to be the key emotion within it. And in fact, I think in Kent, for the people who are here, rather than using the term EBSA, the educational psychology team there would use the term ABSA, which is anxiety-based school avoidance, or ABSNA, which is anxiety-based school non-attendance. Anxiety is something we know that kind of can trigger the automatic threat responses, so that desire to flight, to just kind of run away, to fight, to freeze or flop. And we know that anxiety can impact, our has a sort of somatic impact. It can affect how we feel as well. So there can be genuine feelings of being unwell. We've got here the so I just where I hadn't moved across. We've got here the hot cross bun model from CBT techniques, where you look at that connection between the thoughts that someone's having about school and their feeling, and how that impacts upon their body and how it impacts upon their behaviours. So thoughts such as when I get, no one's going to talk to me at lunchtime, will lead to feelings of panic and stress, and the behaviour can then be, I don't want to go in just in case that happens. To sort of other thoughts that we tend to encounter is the work's too hard, I'm going to look stupid. All those feelings of anxiety that then impact the thoughts that then impact how the child's feeling, their heart rate going up, they're just kind of those feelings of panic that lead to the automatic threat responses. Keep trying to. So anxiety is definitely a very big part of emotion-based school avoidance and the somatic impact of those. You can see, anxiety plays out very differently in different individuals, and it can come across as just sort of looking nervous and edgy and fidgety and unsettled, or anger, lashing out. I think my daughter always says, I don't know where she gets it from, TikTok or something. A frightened wolf is more scary or is more dangerous than an angry wolf. So it's that kind of that the way that anxiety is going to impact upon each child will be different. And so it's always helpful to have that iceberg in mind. So what we tend to encounter with children and young people that are experiencing EBSA is a vicious cycle where they're having those negative thoughts about being able to cope at school, and that's then affecting how they're feeling, their behaviours, their their kind of physical response, leading to them not wanting to go into school, avoiding school, and then you'll feel a little bit better temporarily, but then it's much harder to go in the next day because you've started to fall behind a little bit more, if that's what you were worried about. You've maybe fallen a little bit outside of the friendship group. And so there tends to be an embedding of EBSA as this cycle gets more and more embedded, and the child finds it harder and harder to overcome those barriers and get into school. Within like the educational psychology, we find it quite helpful to look at the different factors associated with EBSA based on what are the school factors that are impacting them, what are the factors that are within the child that are impacting their EBSA, and what are the home factors. So sort of separating the factors out like that can be really helpful. I've highlighted the ones that we maybe would associate with experiences of bullying. So not feeling safe with staff or peers, feeling isolated at school. Potentially it might be that the child is feeling anxious about social interactions, particularly if they've had a negative experience of them, or it might be something that doesn't come easy to them. And of course the parent feeling very worried about sending their child in and worrying that they won't be safe. So a helpful way to understand what's happening for the child can be to separate out the barriers to attendance into those three areas. Obviously they do overlap. For children who are being bullied, it's really hard for parents often to let them in, to let them go in. They can feel, those feelings of anxiety about how safe they're going to be. So we know that bullying is a key kind of barrier for children and for their parents. One other way to think about the factors is to separate them into the push and pull factors. So what's pulling the child away from attending school, and what is pushing them into feeling able to go into school? What's making them feel motivated and excited about attending, and what's kind of pulling them away? When we're sort of exploring all the different factors that are affecting a young person who's experiencing EBSA, it can be worth knowing some of the research about attributions and where people attribute kind of, I don't know if you'd use the word blame, but potentially where they attribute the biggest factors in terms of what's going to be making it hard for the child to come in. And actually this research into attributions is quite interesting just in general, but when you look at it specifically regarding EBSA, young people tend to see the school as responsible for their absence. So you hear kind of phrases like, oh, they're not really doing anything, they haven't really taken me seriously, they don't really want to help, I'm not really wanted there, not feeling welcome. School tend to attribute EBSA to family factors, so the parents need to be doing more to bring them in. This isn't what always happens, but there isn't potential an attribution kind of bias towards these areas when you look at the research. Parents tend to focus more on within child differences, so it might be that this year they've been finding it really hard, they've been feeling really unsettled, so looking at something in their child that may be a factor. So or they haven't really felt like going back in since they had chickenpox or whatever. And another way that when we're working with children experiencing EBSA within the educational psychology team to try and understand the different factors is we'd use these cards, school wellbeing cards. I have a pack here, I'd highly recommend them. They're called school wellbeing cards, and they really help you explore the different push and pull factors that might be affecting the child. And the way we use them is we'd get the child to go through the cards and look at how how much they felt that the cards were true about them and how much they're not true about them. And so from here you can work out the different factors. So if I kind of pull up a card here, it's like, I worry that something bad would happen, and you'd give that to the young person, and then they can put that on the scale for you. I don't have many friends. I'm feeling pressure to attend school. I worry about break time. And the good thing about those cards as a way of working with young people who are experiencing high levels of emotion and anxiety is that you can pretty much do them without talking if necessary. And sometimes I've gone to the child's home and left them there and then gone back to collect them, and their parents taken a picture of how they've spread them out for me, so that you can do that. That can be very early on in your intervention in trying to understand how the young person's working, because you're really not having to do too many interactions if they're not in that place at that point. You can do the whole thing without saying a word. And then once you've done something like that, you can really then start to build up a picture for that young person of the different factors, the school factors, the child-based factors, and the more family-oriented factors that are impacting upon them. And you can separate them into we either say sort of push and pull, or resilience and risk factors. So what are the risk factors for that young person? And examples of ones for school-based factors would be things like bullying, class size, just feeling overwhelmed, finding it unpredictable. And the resilience ones might be you've got already, a friend that you do feel safe with that you can go in, or a place in school, maybe a club or something like that, where you're going to be okay, where there's a teacher to look after you. So those would be the school-based resilience factors that you can start to build up once you've gone through the cards, or once you know what's happening for that child. So home-based risk factors might be overprotective caregiver style, absence of a parent or carer, different family dynamics, and then positive, like the parent feeling safe with the school, would be a home-based factor that could provide resilience. And for the child-based factors, so how well they're feeling, their social communication needs. We know that both bullying and EBSA have a very high incidence rate with for autistic children. So if you're autistic, you are more vulnerable to bullying, and significantly more vulnerable to bullying, and significantly more vulnerable to EBSA. So those child-based factors could include social anxiety, and the resiliency factors are things like that child's areas of interest and strengths, what support can be put in place for them. And so identifying strengths and interests is a really crucial part of the puzzle when you're trying to work out next steps. So when we're working with a child or young person who is struggling with EBSA and experiencing all of those barriers to coming in, because of that EBSA cycle, which just gets more and more embedded, the earlier that you can get involved and work with the child and help them back in, the better. So early intervention is key. Involving everybody is crucial as well, so that you can avoid those kind of potentially like biased attributions, and help everybody feel safe together. So it's really important to have everybody around the table and everybody kind of trusting each other to be doing their best to provide an environment where the child feels safe. Collecting the voice of the child through things like the well-being cards, just to help you understand what it is about school that's really frightening for that child, and what it is about school that actually they don't mind, that they can come in and do. And then from there, I've really found that support for children with EBSA, whether they're experiencing bullying or whether they're kind of like feeling that they're not welcome there, it really is very individual. There isn't a sort of generic shortcut. So it's finding out working with the system to work out what the next step is. And we've had children where the team have worked out that, or the child has said, look, I find it really difficult to come in, but I think I could come in and sit in reception and look at a laptop showing cat videos on YouTube, I don't know, or something. So it can be quite bespoke. And for some schools, they'd say, no, we can't do that. We're going to have everyone watching cat videos in reception. And for other schools, they might be like, okay, we could do that as long as it's time limited. So it's all about sort of finding a path that works for everybody, and that, you know, kind of everyone in the system is able to sit with and to find time for, and quite often the young person will be able to, you know, say, I do find it hard to come in, but when like so and so meets me at the gate, I feel like they are good at distracting me and getting me through. And it can be quite unexpected. Staff can often be surprised at the person that the child says is the kind of member of staff that they feel helps them come in. So I think, yeah, it's there's no quick fix. It does tend to be sort of like relatively bespoke, but once it starts to work, you do normally feel it does normally sort of take off. It doesn't always go like this, though. It's very much like this, and then, but it does, once you find something that works for that young person, then it can be really impactful. For those children who are finding it really hard and are too anxious to go back in, then we have in Greenwich started to do things like a chill hub, which is just like a place in a community centre by a school where young people who are experiencing entrenched EBSA can just go on a Tuesday afternoon and start to like play Jenga with other people, where they can keep their hood up if they need to, potentially keep hold of their phone, and then, you know, kind of work out what they're going to need to do to be able to get into school. Because often letting go of their phone is really tough for some children, and something that they really need support like recognition that that's going to be really hard, and identifying how they're going to be doing that. Or yeah, so not necessarily straightforward, but it is definitely doable. I wanted to share a case study, which is not like a situation that has been particularly like completely resolved, but just to sort of share the path that and the thinking that goes kind of into how to support a young person, and where potentially in the next section we can think about how using a restorative approach may have had an impact if we'd been able to do that a little bit earlier, or if Rachel had got involved into the system. So I was working with a young person who described that she had made one friend when she got to secondary school, but who was quite possessive of her. So she found that quite tricky. And she was then feeling a bit more excited when she got a bigger group of friends, because it was less sort of dependent on this one person. However, there were some issues then with that group, and the rumors spread around the school that she'd been racist. And then, like, well, she described that they spread like wildfire. And then her mother described that her friends sort of dropped her because they didn't want to be seen as being with someone that had said something racist. Now, because she's at secondary school, obviously all of that spread beyond school as well, on social media, and she felt very much like an outcast and became very fearful about going into school. So I know this isn't kind of maybe this probably is more often the sort of situation that I tend to encounter, where bullying is potentially part of it, but it can be quite ambiguous about whether this was the bully or the bullied, I suppose. But like those kind of where social situations for vulnerable young people have gone wrong, and as a result, someone is finding it very hard to come in. So yeah, Alice became very fearful about going in, and she started off by not feeling she could go into form, and then spending more and more time in the corridor. She felt then she was getting into trouble for being in the corridor, and the teachers would be saying, you know, you need to get back into class. I should be helping someone that needs help. You're fine, you can go in. And then she eventually stopped going in at all, and that cycle became very entrenched. She became very depressed and started to self-harm. And then really it needed ever such a lot of input and support to help her get back to a place where she was able to go to school. So her parents were very proactive and joined got sort of counselling support from a voluntary organisation, and then were really able to kind of stay calm themselves, as it was like even when other people's emotions were going up and down. She managed to engage them with having a tutor, with her parents helping her regulate her emotions. I became involved to do kind of an education and healthcare plan, so that she could have quite a bit more support at school. Her parents really wanted her to go to a specialist provision, but her old school really felt that it would be better for her to go back there, and that with the EHCP they could put in the additional support needed. And that's sort of where I left it, but I would say that took a while. So yeah, it's not straightforward. I think there are some situations where it's great and you step back in as an EP and say, how's it going? And everyone's like, oh no, it's brilliant, she's back in and this is all going well. But there are lots of situations where it does take quite a lot of bit of thinking and planning, and really a lot of flexibility from schools, which is really tough when you've got so many children and young people that you're working with. So it's definitely something, as we've seen, that's on the increase. Persistence is persistent difficulties with attendance is up and up, and regulation of emotions is something that children are needing a lot of support with, and we are seeing, and the evidence suggests there is a big link with EBSA and ASD, and EBSA and bullying, and potentially ASD, and ASD and being vulnerable to bullying. So I think that's my section, Rachel, isn't it? And then we're thinking about using restorative approaches to support children in that situation.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you so much, Rachel, and beautifully on time, which I never manage. And also, I feel like I learn something new every time. So thank you very much. And actually, it's a really good thing that, it's been about a year since the Restorative Approaches service has been part of the Educational Psychology and Wellbeing service, and that's really allowed us to kind of see a lot of the connections between that work and perhaps understand restorative practice in a slightly different way, and how it is connected to emotional health and well-being, and rather than just seeing as a behaviour tool or a kind of very specific intervention, perhaps even within the justice system. So I've copied Rachel's little boxes, although maybe my referencing isn't quite up to scratch, so please forgive me, academic colleagues. So, restorative justice is something that is around definition there from the Restorative Justice Council about how we bring those people harmed by crime or conflict into communication, and allowing everyone to be a part of how, the discussion really about how do we move forward in a more positive way. The justice word, I think, is complex, partly because it's sometimes used within the justice system, but there is that element of justice as balance, which is helpful. But there's also this kind of concept of restorative approaches, which is much more about a kind of a sort of wider underpinning and philosophy and sort of culture of practice, where it's not just we're going to respond when there's a difficulty, it's also we're going to sort of think about how we manage and make and maintain relationships in where we're based. But actually, Rachel, you said something when you were looking at talking about how do you move on from EBSA, what do you do, and it's finding a path that works for everyone. I think that's very similar to what we're doing in restorative practice, is finding a way forward after harm or conflict that works for everybody. So next slide, please. Some kind of key kind of principles that we need to think about that really sets it apart from other approaches, and that's whatever context it's used, is that it's not just seeing harm as a violation of the rules or the law. You broke the rule, you kind of went against, you violated what we expected of you, and here's the consequence. It's also seeing harm as a violation of the people and the relationship. So yes, there may need to be a consequence, there may be discussion or maybe no movement on what that consequence has to be, but the key thing is that just by having a consequence in place, we're not going to resolve this, because it's about the people and the relationship. So we need to do something to respond to harm in that way. The other key thing that really sets it apart, and I can't emphasize this enough really, is the fact that it's involvement of all individuals. So for many years of working with people who've been victims, it's often people don't get their say, and I think that can be repeated in schools sometimes. There's so much effort and emphasis on how do we support behaviour change with those people who are causing causing difficulties or those people who are struggling, and there's not necessarily the same kind of how do we support the people who've been on the other side of that. So it's really key about involving everyone, and it's empowering as well. It's not our agenda as the adult or as the professional. It's a continual art of getting over yourself as being a restorative facilitator, because it's about understanding the needs of those people in that situation and what they need to move on. So other Rachel used words like unique and kind of personalize and individualize, and it's very much about that. Yes, we have a structure with which we work to, but it's about what is going to make the difference to you in the situation, given who you are and your experience and what happened. And the other really important thing to say, which I think can sometimes be forgotten in the rush to promote restorative practice in schools particularly, is that we do have a bit of a mantra about not doing any further harm. So sometimes that means that we're not going to do a restorative process, and that's okay, because our main thing is about trying to restore and repair rather than kind of causing further harm. So sometimes it's absolutely more harmful to bring people together who've had a conflict to try and repair it, and we need to be kind of clear that, you know, we're having our best intentions, that that's not going to happen. Next slide, please. So how it works in practice, this is obviously just some very key points. Like I said, it's a big journey to become a facilitator and kind of make this happen. So it is really about the importance of preparation, and what we mean by that is the individual work that you do with the people involved, to really get them to understand their own, you know, reflect on how they feel and what their needs are, and doing that in a safe space. So we often talk about, you know, this concept of script. So, you know, if you have two people in the same scene with the same script and, you know, you bring them together again, the same thing's just going to happen. And yet often that's what happens with schools. It's like, oh, you've fallen out, and then you're going to be in lesson together again, you know, and it will be fine, you know, because you've had a detention and it will all magically be fine. So it's really those individual kind of meetings. That concept of preparation is a chance to kind of rewrite the individual scripts. Also, we talk about restorative practice, especially those individual meetings, being the stairs rather than the lift. And what we mean by that is that, you know, maybe we understand we need to get from A to B, so not being in lessons or not being friends or kind of whatever, and we kind of know what needs to happen. So we just go in and we kind of put young people, or whoever we're working with, we sort of say, okay, here we go, we're getting from A to B, this is what you need to do, I'll press the button, there you go, it's resolved. Whereas actually that kind of avoids the opportunity to do that work of each of the steps, like what is it, how did you feel about that, and what happened before, and have you ever felt like that before, and what could we do differently, and actually to get to the same point. But if you're doing it that way, then the people know the way, and you don't have to always be the one that solves it for them. As I've mentioned as well, there's a real big emphasis on understanding needs, so that's personalised and it's focusing, and the fact that we're doing that, we're helping individuals to reflect, is about building skills and building resilience. Not a lot of people know that there is a whole book, believe me, it's a very thick book, of national occupational standards for restorative practice. Hopefully those of you who have trained, you know, you had some awareness of that. And it's really about making sure that there is kind of, we're taking care in our work, and we're not just saying, oh, we have to do this because it's part of the behaviour policy, even if though we know it's going to not work and make things worse. And so that involves sort of assessing risk, or understanding at least what they are. And it's about having quality and skill of what restorative practice is and how we deliver it. And it's very much around kind of giving voice and then enabling choice. So what we mean by that is that kind of talking it through. What is it that you would like to happen? How could that work? What would happen if we did nothing? And then these are the options, and then sort of deciding, is this going to be right for you or not? So it's kind of holding those two things. So just to kind of bring it back to bullying during this anti-bullying week session, obviously, oh, I tried to move the slides, but I can't do that. Sorry, Rachel, I'm moving to the next slide. So I'm sure those of you who came to Claire and Amy's webinar yesterday, and those of you who are kind of in that world. So some things that we know about bullying in general, but specifically in schools: it is a social process. It's about roles, relationships and power. It has a significant impact, and it's long lasting. So that can be within the sort of child and adolescenthood, but also it can have an adverse impact in adults' life. So it's in adult life, so it's far reaching. there's real, and I'm sure those of you who work within education now really can understand the kind of enormity of the online social media challenges, sort of cyberbullying, and how these, even though they may not happen at school, they may happen kind of, in the middle of the night or kind of at weekends, they definitely show up in real life relationships, and in the school day. And that's something that's a real challenge that schools have to deal with. And when we're thinking about interventions, it's a lot about how we can prevent there to be bullying, but also how do we respond. So I know Claire's done some brilliant research around kind of friendship. Quality friendships can be a real protection against bullying, but there's also kind of things around conflict resolution skills and how we're able to manage that can support us, can support children and young people either to kind of not be there in the first place, or to kind of build their resilience if it happens and they know how to respond, so those impacts aren't as big. But in relation to thinking about restorative practice and bullying, the next slide, this again, restorative processes are social processes. They are absolutely about roles, relationships, and power. But what they do, which is, I think, quite unique, is providing a structure for managing those roles and perhaps giving participants a skill to overcome that. It is all about, enabling, it's all about understanding impact. And because of that, it is giving space and voice to those individuals who have been harmed, which we've just been talking about. And in relation to the sort of online and offline challenges, actually it is working to build that emotional literacy, that empathy, understanding, and the solutions in the real world, because we can't perhaps avoid the online world, but we need to do something about what's happening in school. And the interventions that we have in restorative practice are both proactive, how can we make and maintain meaningful relationships, and also reactive, how do we respond when this situation has happened. So we can see that actually it's really well suited, if done properly and skillfully and in a quality way, to managing and sort of supporting and responding where there has been bullying. And so now I guess hopefully that was a whistle-stop tour of restorative practices. So hopefully that makes sense to everyone. But I want to come now into kind of bringing that all together with what Rachel was talking about in relation to EBSA. So quite a long time ago now, it feels like only yesterday, but in 2016, there was an interesting roundtable event and a report that was led by the Centre for Social Justice, which was about bullying and self-exclusion. So actually, I was talking to Rachel about this yesterday, and we think that, it doesn't use the term EBSA in there, and possibly it was before that term was really kind of utilised, but absolutely what it's talking about is the fact that some children and young people were not going to school with their parents' knowledge because they were being bullied and they didn't feel that they were safe, and so they were kind of self-excluding. And then of course there are certain things that would kick in terms of processes and procedures. So really interesting. I'm sure it's still available. I can send it to anyone who's interested, but there's some really interesting points in there that it raised when it was looking at this issue. So one of them is, in some schools, there's like a lack of a community ethos, so schools being run more like organizations than communities, which complicates how we deal with bullying. It's quite interesting. Also, very punitive complaints culture. I wonder how many of you feel like that. You can perhaps identify that. So it's encouraging a defensiveness in both schools and among parents in like, no, you're doing this. No, you're not doing that. No, it's your fault. No, it's your fault, rather than actually responding to the issues. And it was quite interesting with Rachel's slide about the attributes, that often perhaps the school are thinking that perhaps there's something to do with the family and what's going on at home, and perhaps the family and parents are thinking, well, actually the school's not doing this about this other young person. So you can really see how that relationship is quite tense, and maybe it's very kind of defensive rather than getting to the heart of it. So one of the recommendations in that report was about improving the relationship, and there was quite a few really good ones, but one of the key ones that we kind of honed in on was about improving the relationships between schools and parents when dealing with allegations of bullying by appointing local mediators to manage the complaints or to manage those issues. And when I read that, which probably was around 2016, it really made me think about how actually local mediators is kind of what we had with our restorative kind of practice community in Greenwich. So we trained a lot of people over the years, and we had people who were facilitating or very keen to facilitate. So there was a kind of a reflection and exploration about how could restorative practice, and a restorative practice that we know and love and use, how could that be useful within this context? And so one of the things that came up with, and we had a few false starts due to maternity leave and COVID and things like that. But one of the key things that we do, if I can have the next slide, Rachel, thank you, is our kind of restorative facilitation service or conflict clinic model. So that is where we're able to connect restorative practice facilitators with individual referrals or participating schools. So schools who might buy that in as a service that they have, like they would have a counselling service. So it's about providing skilled and impartial, the local mediators that the report spoke about, to try and unpick the complex kind of relationship breakdowns. Again, coming back to the kind of attributes that Rachel was talking about in relation to EBSA, there's a real complexity of relationships there, and what everybody needs, how much people are feeling heard, and the systems that we have there, which ultimately is what needs to happen to respond to young people who are perhaps not going into school, or there's issues, is something that can work with everybody. And so therefore you need a degree of kind of being separate from that, sort of a degree of impartiality, to really, and time, don't you, to do that. So it's also possible for us facilitators, and they have worked with parents, and they have that time and the training and the lack of a sort of history or a separate agenda, which I think sometimes can really be a barrier in those kind of conversations, and it enables them to really feel heard, and have sort of positive ways of doing that. And with this kind of model, we're able to offer it with student and staff, even staff and staff, or staff and parents. So really, and I think where I've put this is a bit confusing, but it's minimizing the pull factors, so keeping children away and young people away from schools, but also the kind of push factors that actually this is resolved if we can see parents being positive about schools, if they can feel heard, if there's strategies in place where they're working together. A bit like Rachel was saying with the cat video one, actually that could be some really important requests, but it's also the context and the way that is discussed and negotiated. So being able to have someone who can hold that space and do that, it has been really key. And as well as that very specific kind of, we have the facilitators, there to do those specific incidents. There's also wider things that can help, like peer mediation programs or, specific training, which can help with that more positive school kind of cultures and community, so that there's, again, more kind of push factors for going back into the school. So just going to end on a little case study, another one. I think that's reflect back to the first one. This was one where it wasn't one where EBSA was an issue, but it was one that perhaps maybe we don't know how much it could have gone down that route. And this is the key thing about restorative practice, being able to be a really kind of useful preventative or kind of management tool in relation to it. So it was a group of girls, there were several fights, there was a huge issue on social media. It wasn't over, it was still kind of going on. There was real kind of themes of power and influence in there in relation to particular young person, who was very, very powerful within that group, kind of called the shots with everybody. And that individual was very powerful, had a lot of influence online. So the main student who was kind of being isolated from the rest of the group was considering changing schools. But then there was that risk of kind of actually wherever she went, it would follow her with the kind of messages online. And also we know that kind of transition thing could be a really vulnerable time for things like stopping going to school. It just is too much to do that. And there weren't quality friendships around that. So the restorative process that happened there was very much built around need. So it's not this magic one size fits all, we just do the same thing every time. It's really about, that personalized, individualized kind of understanding. So there was those individual preparation meetings that we've spoken about. And then rather than one big meeting where it was kind of, I think there was 9 of them or something, or 8 of them, it was individual. So it was the excluded or the isolated student with one student, and then with another student, and then with a couple of other ones, which gave her more of a sense of power, but it also enabled that really complex and nuanced discussion of each relationship and what needed, because it was different. How it was with one was not what she needed. And when we did those individual meetings and had the sort of meetings together, but in a smaller way, it really enabled those students to all have their own voice. Like, actually, I know what it feels like to be you. I've been excluded before, and it's not, I've been isolated by so and so before, and it's not nice. So how can we do that? So what that enabled was them to all coexist peacefully at the school. They weren't friends. She then became part of a different group, but it kind of avoided that further breakdown and the kind of potentially isolation and self-exclusion. There's nobody at school that I can talk to. They're all looking at me. They're gonna turn on me. And a bit like if we compare that to the situation, the case study that Rachel spoke about, which I think was Alice, actually that didn't happen. So that was able to just continue and then became the cycle. And so what restorative practices can kind of offer really is an opportunity to either get there right at the beginning of that's happening. So we do it sort of soon after and explore it so it doesn't kind of get too ingrained and then it sort of gets beyond really. So kind of preventative, or maybe even coming in a sort of safe process that can come in slightly later in the cycle to sort of change that kind of anxiety. And one of the key things that we will do in those meetings of bringing together or even separately is that real kind of like future thinking. So yes, we do a lot of the kind of scales and thinking through and kind of managing the fact that sometimes two different things are both true. But really we're negotiating, we're thinking about that future relationship. So when you see each other, what are you going to do? Are you going to smile? Are you going to ignore each other? Are you going to just be friends again? What does that look like? So you're really reducing that anxiety that comes from what's going to happen when I see them and what's that going to mean. And that I think is something that's so unique to it and so powerful that we are. It's a space and a structure to enable children and young people to do that, to kind of say, these are my anxieties about what's going to happen and how do we move on from that. So I think I did it to time as well. This never happens, guys. Wow. So we've got time now for questions. And actually, the last slide is just a thank you and our email addresses. So I don't know if we should come off the share. I don't know. But yeah, there's an opportunity for questions and our email addresses there as well. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you both so much for such an interesting talk. I just wonder if anyone has, we've got some hands up already. So